Everyone. My name is Brian Herrick. I'm currently the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Philadelphia FBI office, but most recently I served as the Chief of FBI Headquarters Violent Crimes Against Children and Human Trafficking Program. And today I'm here to talk to you about that program and the importance of protecting our children when they're online. When we were coming up with a title for this presentation, we had selected Not Children's Play, Stranger Danger on Virtual Playgrounds. And if you're a bit closer in age to me, you remember your parents and teachers talking to you about stranger danger. And we still do that. If you have kids like I do, you've spoken to your kids about stranger danger. But in the last decade or so, that term has taken a very different connotation. Stranger danger for you and I may have been just that, the creepy guy on the playground who's there with no children. And what we've encouraged parents and caregivers and children to do is to report that. You see someone on the playground who doesn't look right, doesn't appear to be there with children, maybe talking to children, offering them candy. That's a problem. And we want people to report that and not have people hanging around playgrounds looking to get access to our children. But as you can imagine, in 2020, the amount and use of the internet by our kids is growing significantly. So I'm going to start by referring to a Pew Research study that came out last year, and it talked about the fact that 95% of teens have access to smartphone technology, and about 45% of teens say that they are online almost constantly was the term that they used. So what are those teens doing online? And so what they list is YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Reddit as the top 7 or 8 forms of social media they use on a regular basis. And again, these students who were surveyed, teenagers between 13 and 19, surveyed to see what their habits were. And many of them are saying that they are online almost constantly. Another group that we work with called the We Protect Global Alliance, it's an NGO, discusses the threat against children as being a persistent threat. My background is mainly in cybercrime. It's what I've worked for approximately 18 years as an agent in the FBI. And when we talk about the cyber threat, that's how we describe it, the advanced persistent threat. And nowadays, the threat to children is being discussed in the exact same way. One of the things that the study talked about was the fact that offenders are developing networks to discuss with each other their sexual interest in children. So let me take you back 2 to 3 decades ago. An individual who looked at what we then called child pornography was a lone individual in their house, in mom's basement, looking at dirty magazines. In the intervening 2 or 3 decades ago, that same individual who has a sexual interest in children is communicating with a large, robust, and extremely active group of offenders doing that same activity. So again, 2 and 3 decades ago, that individual was doing that activity in a vacuum. They were not discussing their interest in children with others. It's not socially acceptable in a face-to-face situation to discuss such a topic. But now in 2020 and for the past 5, 6 years, offenders have been congregating in growingly large forums online to the tune of hundreds of thousands of members and discussing their sexual interest in children. And here's why that's a problem. It is helping to normalize their behavior. It is helping to make normal in their mind to have a sexual interest in children. And it is helping to normalize their hands-on offenses against children. And so I want to talk today about some of the different ways that children are being exploited online. So in the FBI, we try to do a number of things. Our main mission, to protect the American people, to uphold the Constitution. But within crimes against children, we're trying to counter the threat that we have to children. We're trying to make safer, vulnerable populations against child exploitation and human trafficking. And as importantly, we're trying to build partnerships and train and educate our federal, state, local, and international partners in how we investigate this crime problem. To just give you some quick numbers, at our FBI headquarters, we have approximately 90 individuals working from a headquarters program management perspective, and they help do program management for about 450 agents in the field who are partnered up with over 800 task force officers representing about 400 different law enforcement agencies at the state and local levels in the US. Importantly, in this type of crime and any crime that has a cyber infrastructure or basis to it, is an international task force. Since 2004, the FBI has been leading an international task force of approximately 70 members representing about 55 different countries throughout the world. You cannot effectively investigate a cyber-based crime that crosses borders, not just state and local borders, but international borders, with having good, key, thorough, and real-time partnerships. And you can imagine real-time partnerships are difficult when you're dealing across time zones and with language barriers. And so the FBI recognized that a number of years ago and built an international task force that we bring task force officers from foreign law enforcement here to the US every single summer, give them about a month of training in some of our investigative techniques in this area, and then send them back to their home agencies, but then keep in touch with them. And they assist us in working these crimes that go across borders, much like we offer assistance to them when they're working a case with a nexus to the United States. And so, as I mentioned, task forces are critical. We work with our state and local partners, approximately 98 human trafficking and child exploitation task forces led by the FBI here in the United States. We also work, as I mentioned, with NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Two in particular that I'd like to mention are Thorn, an organization that was founded by Ashton Kutcher and Demi Moore a number of years ago, who does a phenomenal job developing technology in order to address what we now call CSAM, child sexual abuse material. The term child pornography is not used by law enforcement any longer. I cringe a bit when I see that in the media reported as child pornography, but the widely accepted term used to refer to the material is just that, child sexual abuse material. And Thorn is doing some amazing things with technology to identify and rid the internet of CSAM material. Another very close strategic partner that we work with is NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, founded back in 1984 by John and Reve Walsh after the abduction and murder of their son, Adam. NCMEC is based in Alexandria, Virginia, and the FBI has agents and analysts that are embedded with NCMEC in their headquarters and facility, monitoring the cyber tip reports that electronic service providers and the public are referring into their national clearinghouse. We also work with a number of large international agency partners such as Europol and Interpol as well, working these cases. So there are four main areas that the FBI works on with regard to child exploitation and human trafficking. Child abductions and kidnappings. As you can imagine, these are extremely high impact cases, and fortunately they are somewhat low frequency. We have a dedicated team of individuals, special agents and intelligence analysts that work since 2005 on what we call CARD, the Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team. They roll out and are regionally based to observe child abductions within the United States. In those years since they've been created, approximately 170 deployments, resulting in approximately 79 children recovered alive, 85 deceased, and 4 or 5 that are still missing to this day. It's a highly technical team that works with our behavioral analysis unit out of Quantico, Virginia, to identify the best leads possible to try and find missing children who very often are killed by their abductor within the first 24 to 48 hours of the abduction. I've mentioned, and I'll mention more on the program today, about the online sexual exploitation of children. As I mentioned, that has changed in dramatic ways. When I was a child, the way I got information was to the encyclopedia set that existed in the living room of my house or the local library. That is not the way that children get access to information today. The Pew Research study gave you that list of different social media platforms where most kids go to get their information. The one good thing about that encyclopedia in my house in the library was it was curated. It was curated material that had been professionally reviewed, edited, and made for consumption by age-appropriate individuals. When you go to YouTube and Instagram and see things on Snapchat and Reddit, that is not curated. That information is put up there mostly in an unedited form, and I take nothing away from those platforms. They have much good information out there. But the fact that many times it is not curated, it becomes a source where children gain access to information. And children can gain access to all kinds of information, as you can imagine, on the internet. So we'll come back to the online exploitation of children. I'll mention child sex trafficking and human trafficking. Two other areas that our section focuses on at headquarters: domestic minor sex trafficking, where minors here in the US are trafficked by individuals who prey upon them, either kids that are maybe in the foster system and have left that system and become trafficked as a way to make money for a human trafficker or pimp. The life that these children, because they are minors, lead is often horrible. They are not treated well by traffickers. So if I could paint a scenario for you of an individual who may not be happy at home, who runs away from home, or is in an unfortunate situation of the foster care system and may not get along with other kids in the foster system or a group home that they are part of, many times they are targeted by these traffickers as a way to make money for either the individual or for larger organized crime. We are certainly seeing in the FBI more organized criminal activity that uses trafficking as a form of revenue for the organization. And so that child is often transported from city to city, sometimes by flight, sometimes by vehicle, and is taken to special sporting events and made available more and more so through online advertising. The FBI has taken a number of these online profiles down and offline, and some of these platforms that were, for the most part, dedicated to advertising children for sexual activity, both male and female. This violation does not discriminate, although you will see a higher percentage of female victims. There are many male victims in this crime problem as well. And so the trafficker controls all of their access to outside information. The trafficker controls their money. The trafficker controls what they eat and what clothes that they wear. And so they become beholden to that trafficker as a source of any kind of income, and in some cases, even as a source for food and clothing. So again, the human trafficking and child sex trafficking are two other areas that our section focuses on. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the online exploitation, that stranger danger. I'll talk how the threat has evolved, how this violation has migrated to the dark web, and I'll define what the dark web is. I'll talk about sextortion, and I'll also talk a little bit just at the end, because we are filming this in the spring of 2020, so I would be remiss if I didn't mention at least the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that's having. So with regard to the online threat, we are seeing a tremendous increase in scale, both in the volume of images and the number of offenders. This is a type of crime problem that is not driven by money. There are not, while there exist certain websites that will charge offenders a monetary fee for access to child sexual abuse material, that is not what drives this violation. It is not what drives the economy of child sexual abuse material. That is driven by the content itself. And so if you can look at this from the perspective of an individual who has access to a child, who produces an image or a video of child sexual abuse material, that image or video has tremendously high value, because if it was just produced, it's not been seen before. And if it's not been seen before, it has tremendous value amongst this offender community, numbering in the millions of offenders. And so it can be traded with incredibly high value, but like anything, As it's traded and becomes seen over and over again, its value goes down, and it's supply and demand. And I don't mean to trivialize or reduce this to an economic equation, but it is just that, supply and demand. If I have access to a child and I have a sexual interest in that child, and I have a video camera, which today is absolutely trivial with the proliferation of high quality digital cameras and smartphone devices, I can create something that has extremely high value 24 hours a day, and then trade that to get access to more material myself. So the currency really that drives this economy is content. It is the CSAM material. It is not money that changes hands. So with the proliferation of high quality digital video, the volume of imagery is going up dramatically. And with the advent of more anonymous technologies, which I'll talk about in a moment, the ability for people to talk about this topic and to share imagery without fear of being found, or the perceived fear of not being found, is rising to the number of offenders. And I'll talk a little bit about how many offenders in certain platforms we're seeing. Things are getting more complex, certainly more complex for law enforcement due to the use of the dark web, certainly due to the use of encryption. And as I mentioned before, as we see more and more individuals participating in this activity from different countries, you can imagine that trying to locate an individual in a foreign country with an IP address that you may or may not readily get access to, which identifies their location in their computer, can be very challenging. Again, this goes back to the importance of our international task force, having police around the world working with us to help identify those individuals. What we're also seeing in the last 3 to 5 years is the egregiousness with which this content is increasing. We're seeing production going up because people have a way to film and make an image of it, but we're also seeing younger offenders. And so you have the rise of the cases of production. We've seen from the past 5 years or so a 60% increase in the number of cases of production that we are charging by the U.S. Department of Justice. 60% increase in the production cases that we're seeing. We're also seeing more offenders moving to the dark web. I mentioned before, it forms a bit of a social network for them. You and I think of a social network in very different terms, our Facebook, our Instagram, LinkedIn, different social media platforms where we engage with others, typically around topics of common interest. But you can imagine that the topic of common interest for these individuals make it so that they cannot operate in many of the well-known public social media platforms, although we do see plenty of that activity take place, and the tech companies in Silicon Valley have a full-time job identifying CSAM material and inappropriate grooming of children on their networks that they report into NCMEC and the FBI every single day. But they have migrated to the dark web. The dark web typically referred to by one of the larger, more popular networks known as Tor, the onion router. Using Tor used to be somewhat complicated. Even a decade ago, you would have to download a couple different software packages, know a little bit about networking to get it working right. Today, a very untech savvy individual, my grandmother, could download the Tor browser, much like you would download Firefox or Chrome or another browser, and away you go. Anonymous browsing of the internet, anonymous communication with others on topics that are not socially acceptable to talk about in open forums. And so we've seen a massive move of this offender set towards Tor to try and communicate anonymously with each other, going back to creating this normalization of their activity. We've also seen a dramatic rise in something called sextortion. In 2019, the FBI did a large media campaign in the summer of 2019 about sextortion, which is when an adult identifies a child and entices and encourages them to produce sexually explicit material, often by tricking them, and then using that material to further extort them to produce more and more and more imagery under fear of releasing those sexually explicit videos or pictures to social media friends. So they take those pictures, they say, you've just recorded this video. I'm now going to send this to your principal, the pastor at your church, your parents, your grandmother that we found on your Facebook contacts. And so you can imagine, as that 13, 15, 19-year-old individual who's being told that now their naked imagery is going to be sent out for all to see, many times their reaction is to do what they're told, which is to produce more and more content. And you can imagine what that then creates. That creates an increase in the volume of CSAM imagery that's out there. But more importantly, it creates a teenager who is in a devastating situation. They have to continually abuse themselves through coerced production online on a webcam, multiple times a day, at home, in the restroom at school, in public places, in order to comply with the demands of the sextortionist, who is looking to take that material and then trade with others for access to similar content. So sextortion is certainly an emerging trend that we're seeing. It's having devastating effects on the psychological behavior of teenagers. There are links to suicidal ideations. And it's one of those things where when we identify someone, when it's been reported to us, and we find someone who is committing sextortion type of activity, they are not sextorting just 1, 2, or 10 individuals. There's often hundreds of children that they are extorting at any given time. And so when we identify one of those people and find them, we have what can be a Herculean effort to try and identify potentially hundreds of children that have been extorted, who've been sexually exploited online, and whose imagery is now coursing throughout the internet. So we have an entire division within our program, Operation Rescue Me. The sole job of those agents and analysts is to look at those videos, which are very difficult to watch, and try to identify who those children are so that we can make identifications to them and their parents and get them the help that they need. We often see crowdsourcing where individuals are using readily available video conferencing software to gain access to a child or a teenager in order to further sexually exploit them. We see a lot of virtual cyber dens. We have a program that focuses on child sex tourism, where individuals travel from the United States to different areas of the world that are known to be sex tourism hotspots in order to get access, physical access to children. And many times they engage with those children initially via some sort of live streaming sexual acts. There are a number of people in foreign countries who exploit sometimes their own children in order to make a profit, in order to support a family. And that creates an industry where sex offenders here in the United States and around the world will pay for access to live sex shows where they can direct the activity of what happens to those children. Many times then those offenders will act on those inclinations and will travel internationally. And we have a program in a number of foreign countries and working with our other federal partners and host nations to identify those individuals and interdict them before they are able to put hands on a child in those foreign countries. So I had mentioned Tor, the onion router, is an area that has been used by criminals for a variety of criminal activity. There is a very valid reason that someone might want to use Tor as a way to communicate effectively anonymously, whether that be a whistleblower, a political dissident in a foreign country who's the victim of an oppressive regime. Those are all very valid and noble reasons why somebody would use the Tor network to communicate anonymously. But we've seen time again, cyber criminals, drug and weapons traffickers, money launderers, people involved in terroristic activity, and certainly people who are exploiting children using Tor in order to communicate and also to host illegal content of child sexual abuse material, and that's growing each year. I mentioned earlier the numbers of people that we see in some of these large-scale forums that are hosted within the Tor network. areas of 189,000, 945,000 in one forum, 509,000 in another. And they also have support forums that don't host actual content, but again, are an area where individuals can talk about like-minded activity of how they would get access to a children. It's like a virtual instruction sheet in those forums of how one can act on their thoughts and desires to get access to a child, the best way to videotape it, the steps to take to thwart law enforcement, how to encrypt their data and make sure they're not identified by law enforcement. So I mentioned encryption, and that's something that has been thwarting law enforcement for a number of years, more so recently with end-to-end encryption being used in many default modes in a variety of instant messaging applications. And so the FBI, like other law enforcement, both here in the US and around the world, have tackled this issue through our lawful access initiative, where while we believe in good, robust, strong encryption in terms of creating privacy for citizens, we also believe that a provider of electronic content should be able to provide access to data with court orders, that a neutral judge determines that there is some probable cause that some criminal activity exists in an account online and signs off on that we provide to an electronic service provider. And so the FBI and US and international law enforcement has been working towards this idea of lawful access and getting access to potentially encrypted data where we believe criminal activity has taken place. Some other challenges we have, as I've mentioned a few times now, is international cooperation. We have 70 some odd members of our international task force, but there are more countries than that. And so there are several countries that we don't have communication with on a regular basis, where activity takes place, and it becomes much more challenging in some of those situations to identify where a case is taking place. One great example I can give you was recently in one of our field offices down south. A provider had monitored their network and was seeing the live streaming sexual abuse of a 7-year-old girl. And they were able to very quickly look at what account it was coming from. The individual who created that account had to, in order to have streaming capabilities, take a photograph, scan, and send in their national identity card from a foreign country that turned out to be in Eastern Europe. We were able to very quickly get on the phone with our legal attaché based in that country, and also the state police officer who was a member of our task force and had been through our training in the middle of the night, and identify through their provider in their country the IP address of where the streaming was taking place. And within a number of hours, 75 miles outside of the capital city, the state police in that country were able to effect a search warrant and rescue that 7-year-old from what had been months to years of abuse that was going on by a relative. And so the ability to work in real time is really, really important with regard to these cases, because more and more we are seeing the abuse taking place in real time due to live streaming capabilities of individuals. The laws of the United States do not apply necessarily outside the US, and so there are no real global cybercrime laws. There are a number of conventions that the US and other countries subscribe to about what should take place on the internet, but the US government doesn't own the internet. That is owned by private industry around the world. And so based on the fact that we don't have global cybercrime laws, we're continually challenged because digital evidence is the really only form of evidence that can truly disappear in a moment. And so it's really important for law enforcement to have good contacts with those international partners, as well as good contacts with private industry, so that when we have a child that's being abused, we have the capability to obtain data to see where that child is and to rescue them from that abuse. You can imagine that law enforcement and governments are not always on the forefront of the technology curve. In fact, we're mostly on the back of that curve, oftentimes due to lack of funding and just being able to keep up with new technology that is being released at the bleeding edge. We find many of our offenders are very tech savvy and are using that technology, again, to hide themselves on the internet, to use certain things to encrypt their data so that if we come and do a search warrant, we're not able to get that evidence off of their computers. I am happy to say that we work very closely with our technology partners, both in private industry and internal ones here in the FBI, to develop sophisticated techniques to identify individuals who would be looking to harm children no matter where they are in the world. I'm just going to end, because we're at the time limit right now, to talk a little bit about the pandemic and COVID-19 that certainly gripped the world, but specifically here in the United States in about mid-March. As you can imagine, with schools closing down over much of the country, individuals were sent home from work and students were sent home from school. And that did two things. Many students were given devices by their school district to allow them to get onto the internet with little to no instruction, potentially with little monitoring that was taking place. And now they are at home 24 hours a day, probably not with a full 8-hour workload for schoolwork. And so they're now home on the internet, being required to be on the internet. And in particular, because of how remote education was set up in that very quick time period, many of them were required to be on web cameras like I am with you here today, who may not have had experience like that before. And so unfortunately, that well-meaning process of remote education helped to desensitize students to be online and to communicate via webcam that they may not have before. Parents may not have allowed that with good caution. And so students are becoming desensitized to being on camera and to displaying themselves on camera at a time when individuals were sent home from work, and individuals who are our offender set who look to sexually exploit children now had much more freedom, much more privacy in their home environment, potentially without internet monitoring that a company might do, to be online to try and identify those children. And that causes us great concern and will cause us great concern as we move forward. As I record this, a number of states are moving into yellow and green phases. Most of the school years are over now, but we also see that many summer camps are now closed. And so we will have a lot of kids sitting at home this summer with extra time on their hands with internet connected devices that could lead to trouble. So we encourage parents to have good open dialogue with children about what that means and the responsibility that that comes with. But we also identify that the amount of child abuse reporting has actually gone down while we have kids trapped at home, oftentimes with their abusers, because many times the reports of that abuse were done by people outside the home, parents, teachers, coaches, who would have identified the telltale signs of a child that's being physically or sexually abused. And so now that many kids are not seeing the coach, the counselor, the school teacher, that reporting is going down. And so the effect that this pandemic has had and is having on children with regard to their sexual exploitation and potentially sexual abuse is really concerning for law enforcement. We've seen the amount of cyber tip reports that have come into the National Center go up dramatically. Year over year, those numbers are going up dramatically. Every year, those numbers typically go up as more providers report that activity. But we have seen a spike in those numbers looking at the months of March, April, and May of more kids being online and more kids being exploited and their imagery being sent across the internet. The imagery, unfortunately, there is no delete button for the internet. We get calls all the time into the FBI from a distraught parent who says, my child sent an inappropriate video of their body out on the internet. Can you please get it back? Can you please take it down? Can you please delete it? And the unfortunate answer to that parent is often no. While we can notify the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to the presence of that video, and they can work to try and identify where that is, taking that video down can be a very challenging task, especially as those videos transit over into the dark web or deep web. And so we tell those parents again to have those discussions up front with children about appropriate use of the internet and what's appropriate to do with webcams. So we're hopeful as we get further along in the pandemic. I don't think anybody knows what the future specifically holds, but as we're seeing more people come out of quarantine and stay-at-home orders being lifted, we're hoping that as children engage more with counselors and coaches and teachers to be able to identify where abuse might be happening. But you can imagine the cycle of victimization that a child goes through, and whether we're talking about a teenager that's 14 or 15 that may have been coerced to produce a video of themselves via a webcam, or we're talking about a 6, 7, 8-year-old who was physically abused by a caregiver or parent or family member, and then who recorded that abuse and then uploaded that to the internet. That cycle of victimization never ends. There are children and videos that I saw early in my career with the FBI as a forensic examiner. Those same videos and those same victims are still being found on the computers of subjects whose systems we seize today. And so that was 18 years ago when I started in the FBI, and those same images are still circulating throughout the internet. And that's the nature of the internet. Once that content is out there, it is out there forever. And so the men and women of law enforcement, and specifically of the FBI, work every single day to try and identify who is looking to exploit our children, how they're doing it, what kind of technologies they are using, trying to figure out ways to identify where these individuals are, working to take imagery of children who are being abused and identify where those children are located so we can rescue them from that abuse. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group today. I've seen different movies and have read different books written about the FBI and different crime problems and different areas that we work in. I think you will find that the people that work in this crime violation in particular, it takes a very special person to be able to come to work every single day and sit down in front of a computer and look at images and videos of children being abused, and then work through that every single day, compartmentalize the abuse, but look for clues in those imagery in order to try and identify where those children are located. It takes a very special person to be able to go out time and time again to work operations on the street where children are being trafficked, and to arrest a trafficker on a Friday night, and then on Monday to see potentially that same trafficker out and that same minor victim back out on the street just days later involved in that same trafficking type of violation. So it takes a very special individual to be able to do that type of activity, to engage through undercover work where they have to talk with these individuals about their sexual interest in children, and as the undercover to be able to speak as if you have very similar interests. I've done that work myself as an online covert employee, and it is what I would describe as despicable to have to be able to engage with individuals and speak that kind of language with them in order to further identify if they have access to a child and what they're doing. And so again, it takes a special kind of individual to work those cases, who work time and time again to try and go and find those cases where kids are being exploited, and to take the steps and through court process and search warrants, and working with great federal, state, local partners here in the US and our international partners to identify groups who would look to exploit children. So I wish you good luck with your next work, and the FBI is always happy to answer questions about the work that we do for the American people. Thanks. One thing I just wanted to cover for this audience in particular was some of the myths that you might have about the FBI. We often call this, and actually use as a legal term in court, the CSI effect, that individuals who sit on juries, the average public, know what they see on television about the FBI, about the police, law enforcement in general. And so many times we battle that in court with individuals thinking that we can do everything that you see on television. Gosh, I wish we could do everything that you see on television, but we can't. Some of the best and brightest minds in screenwriting and novel writing have come up with a number of different capabilities for law enforcement that just may not exist, technologies that might not exist. And so many times, crimes have to be solved in, 42 minutes for the average drama show on television. Obviously, that's not realistic for the type of work that we do. So if I'll use the example of a child abduction, you can imagine when that happens, again, obviously very high impact, fortunately low frequency. That's an all hands on deck type of event. But just the logistics of that, if that happens somewhere in the middle of the United States of America, that is a local police issue. Local cops are going to respond to that home or that school where that incident took place. And so just the logistics of notifying the FBI that abduction is in progress, and then us identifying a team that's nearby. Our teams are regional based. Just the logistics of getting that team on the ground. We don't have, we do have access to some private aircraft, but many times our CARD, our Child Abduction Response Team, goes and gets a commercial flight and gets there obviously as quick as possible. Communications can be challenging sometimes. While we are in 2020 now using certainly much more video conferencing than we ever have done, oftentimes we are limited by bandwidth that's available. Sometimes in remote sites that bandwidth just does not exist. And so sometimes we have issues with communicating and communications. All of our agents are not alike. We are all come from different backgrounds. I had a cyber computer background and in IT consultancy. Other people are former military or law enforcement. They might work in the insurance industry. They might be chemistry teachers. And so every agent brings a different specialty to a given team to investigate. And so sometimes the myth that every agent is kind of cut from the same cloth and every intelligence analyst has the same exact background is another myth. We all come with a different background that we have. Many times the smartphone technology that any member of the public have is the smartphone technology that we have. We can't capture DNA with it. We can't photograph fingerprints and get instant analysis. We can't, with a tablet, reposition satellites to be able to go down and try and identify a fugitive on the run or a child that may be tied up in a closet in a farmhouse room. And so that can be a bit frustrating that the technology isn't yet like we sometimes see on television, or that a jury would expect us to be able to present in court. And unfortunately, the burden is on the prosecution to identify that someone has committed a crime. And many times, if we don't present evidence like DNA or satellite footage or CCTV footage of the crime that's actually occurring, that tends to leave an idea in the mind of a juror that somehow we have not proven our case, that the prosecution hasn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the subject has committed the crime. And so that creates a challenge for us. But the FBI remains very much involved with how the FBI specifically is portrayed and how law enforcement is portrayed. And through our Office of Public Affairs, we offer consultative services to consult on different story ideas or storylines that might be in the works. Authors and screenwriters can go to our website, fbi.gov/portrayals, and get some information there about how they can further contact us and to work with us in a consultative type of role on a script or story idea they might have.